If you're starting a new novel, you're somewhere in the middle, or you're struggling to reach the end, these are 3 mistakes that are gonna keep you from reaching the finish line. Number 1, distracting yourself. We've all been there, okay? We spend weeks, months, dare I say years, researching our story, our idea, the world building, figuring out our technology, the magical powers of our main character, pretty much anything but developing and writing the actual story. Now, why does this happen? Sometimes it's because writers are really excited about the world that they're creating. You want to explore all the details that will make your story feel immersive and rich. And it's easy to get caught up in those details because, for one, it's fun. And don't get me wrong, those elements are really important to think through, but you have to be mindful of when it starts to become more of a distraction than a useful part of the writing process. And there's a way to tell whether that's happening. Ask yourself, is this helping me figure out the story? Is this getting me closer to writing? Or am I using this to avoid writing? That's the clincher. Sometimes when we don't know our characters on a deeper level, or we're not sure what's supposed to happen in our story apart from a few scenes, we'll spend more time researching and world building as a way to avoid having to face those unknowns. We'll say, well, if I sit here and stare at my notebook for an hour and I don't put anything down, that feels way less productive than spending an hour Googling cool magical abilities that my character could have. But the reality is, even if you give your character the coolest magical ability possible, it really doesn't matter if you don't know who the character is, why they're in your story, or what story you're even telling. What we want to avoid is having a lot of flashy elements, but a really shallow story. Or, honestly, no story at all, because we keep ourselves so distracted that we never actually end up finishing our first draft. And then it's like, what was the point of all that research anyway? So why does this matter? Well, like I said, if you're using research to distract yourself from writing, you're not going to write, and that's a pretty crucial part of the process. That will derail you from finishing your first draft. Getting too attached to the details of your world can take away from the core of your story, and without a solid plot and a character-driven narrative, all the world building in the world isn't going to make somebody read your novel. Our good friend Tolkien created an amazing world, but that didn't detract from the actual story he was telling, which was just as rich and just as deep. Same goes for your story. The world building and research should never overshadow the emotional stakes and the plot. And this isn't just for fantasy and sci-fi writers either. If you're writing a contemporary story, you can still distract yourself with details. It might just be personality traits and psychological profiles, historical settings, ailments, what a certain city looks like at a certain time of year. All of those things can feel productive, but actually just distract us from writing. So what can you do if you realize you're distracting yourself by world building and researching and all of that? First, I want you to prioritize your plot and your characters. Focus on the story first. That's the most important thing because you're telling a story. That's what you're setting out to do. So if you don't have a story to tell, you're not going to be able to tell it.
What?
Always ask yourself, is this element adding to the plot? Or is it just there as kind of decoration or something cool, but it doesn't really have anything to do with your characters, their development, or your story? Then, once you've figured out your story, create a world that serves that story. And then it could be helpful to set limits for yourself as well. Like, okay, I'm going to set a timer for 30 minutes, and that's how long I'm going to spend world building and researching. Then I'm going to get back to writing. And a bonus tip for you as well is don't try to overcomplicate your world. Don't try to create the world's most unique and intricate magical system that nobody's ever seen before and it's going to revolutionize the world of creative writing. No. Just think about what your story needs and then build from there. What will set your story apart is the specificity of your characters and their journey. What will set your story apart is how it made readers feel. Everything has to work together. So that's number 1, distracting yourself. Number 2 is getting and staying stuck. I don't think I've ever met a writer yet who has not gotten stuck at some point. They hit a snag, usually somewhere in the middle, and they think there's just no way to move through it, to connect their beginning to their ending, to connect the 2 scenes that they had in mind when they started writing, whatever it might be. So it starts out with getting stuck, but then it ends up being, I can't move past this. And that's what I want to help you avoid. So why does this happen? Let's say you're writing your opening chapters and everything is flowing and you're really feeling it. It's so much fun. And then you hit a wall around chapter 5, 6, 7, 10, and you're like, I don't know what happens next. Usually it's because either you've set up so much in your opening chapters that now it's overwhelming trying to figure out how to tie everything together, or you haven't set up enough in those opening chapters, and so there's literally just not enough to keep the story rolling. It could also be a sign that you haven't done enough character development because so much of the story is based on how a character responds and reacts to the events of the plot. So if you're getting stuck, you may not know enough about them to know how they would react, or they may just not have enough personality to react to these types of things. That happens a lot too. It's like, my main character is so bland, they don't have any reactions to anything. We want to avoid that too. So getting to this point and staying stuck, it's really frustrating because you can also hesitate to know which direction to go in. It's like, do I go down path A or path B? What if it's the wrong choice and then I have to rewrite a bunch of things? So this is all what we want to avoid. So this matters because it keeps you stuck in this ongoing loop that makes it really difficult to finish your first draft. And what's more, if you convince yourself that there's no way to fix this problem, you risk abandoning your draft altogether.
Wow, this is garbage.
Because hey, you've got an idea for a cool new story and that feels a lot easier, so you can just start writing that one. It's a vicious cycle, and I don't want this for you. So what can we do about it? First, you really should get honest about your character and plot development. Have you developed your main character enough? Do you know how they're going to change during your story and why? In detail. It's not enough to say he becomes softer because he meets the female main character. Nope. Gotta go deeper than that. Why does he need to become softer? Why isn't he soft already? What about the female main character brings that out in him? These are just a few of the questions you can ask. Then, once you think more about your character, have you thought through your plot with your character in mind? Even just a general overview of each plot point so that you can visually see your beginning connecting to your middle, connecting to your end. Really, really helpful. And if you want help doing that, I really suggest joining the Novel Wayfinder program. I walk you through how to connect your idea to your main character and their arc, how to develop all of your characters, and then how to map your story out piece by piece in a way that is organized and clear and directly connected to your first draft. So if you're interested in that, link below, we can get you started. But if you haven't done those two things, developing your characters, developing your plot, you gotta start there, otherwise you're gonna stay stuck. Assuming you've done all of that, this is the most important thing to do, and that's do not assume there is no solution. Listen, I don't want to hear about you discrediting your own creativity that way. You can absolutely find a way forward, but you have to hold everything you have already with loose hands. Something leading up to the point where you got stuck might need to be changed. Something after the point where you got stuck may need to be changed. So think about your story with a more objective lens. Then, if you've studied storytelling, lean on the craft. What needs to happen at this point of the story internally for your character? Now, some writers would say that you just need to write more and eventually you will find what needs to happen. And I say, hey, if that sounds good to you and you don't mind writing a bunch of new scenes that you might potentially toss out, go for it. It's totally fine. But just know that that might be what happens. But again, if you haven't developed your characters or your story, you aren't super strong on storytelling craft, if those things aren't there, then just writing more isn't really going to help. I know Neil Gaiman has said something like, the easiest way to figure out a plot problem is just to write your way out of it. But that's Neil Gaiman, okay? Like, he's allowed to say that. When we're writing our first novel for the very first time and we're new to the whole thing, we don't get to say that because we're not Neil Gaiman. It doesn't mean it's the most effective or efficient way for every writer at every stage of the process. So if you're really struggling with this, some bonus tips for you. Let your first draft be less than perfect. The idea is to get the story down, flaws and all, and then fix the problems later. Now, ideally, you will have your story mapped out before you write so that the number of big structural problems that you have is as low as possible. But if you haven't done that and you're getting stuck, try something. As you write one scene or another scene, ideas might come up. Then again, this is where actually I would suggest starting is think about what you've already set up in your story. What threads do you already have that you can just continue? Do you know what I mean? Like, if you've set up enough in your beginning, the middle should take care of itself. Consequences should be building tension. Your protagonist should be on a trajectory toward growth, and all you really need to do is let that roll. For example, I wrote my first novel about a high school swimmer. And so those opening chapters established her goal to make the state meet, her goal to win a scholarship, her disdain for her brother's sudden illness that sends him back home to live with her, the introduction of another person from her past who's returned that she doesn't like. So once all that is set up, now my main character has to deal with all of that on top of like trying to swim faster and keep her grades up. That's like 7 different things that I can keep going through the middle. So the middle is sometimes about just allowing what you've set up to play out and build tension naturally. The third and final mistake that will keep you from finishing your first draft is jumping too far ahead. So what do I mean by this? This can take a number of forms. You might rush into writing too soon. You might want your draft to be perfect right away. You might start editing it as you write. You might spend a ton of time thinking about publishing and how and where and when, and you haven't even started writing yet. These are all signs that you're jumping too far ahead. So why does this happen? Listen, writing a novel is a long process, okay? It is not like creating a painting or choreographing a dance. Like, we are not going to do this in a couple of days or a couple of weeks. Novels are just too complex. And that's what's great about them. All the best things take time. But we as writers tend to be a little impatient, and we're excited and we want to get to the end result because that's the dream, right? The dream isn't, oh, I can't wait to spend another 3 hours today working on the same chapter because I just can't get it right. Like, the dream is, I can't wait to open a box and see a book with my name on it. I can't wait to walk into Barnes & Noble and see a book with my name on it on the shelf. That's the dream, so we want to get there, right? But it just takes a long time and we're impatient, we're excited. So we do what I said earlier and we get into writing too soon before we've developed the story, and we start editing as we go, and we start thinking about publishing when we haven't even written a story yet. Each of these things comes with its own pitfalls. If you start writing too soon, you're likely going to end up with more plot holes, which means longer revision time, more frustration, more discouragement, and that'll cause you to make mistake number 2 that we've already talked about. Ultimately, if you start writing too soon, it just creates more work for you later, and that's usually more discouraging. And we tend to start writing too soon because we're really excited and we want to kind of ride that creative wave while it's there. But as your coach, I have to tell you the hard truth, which is that's not always going to be there. There will come a day, multiple days, many days, when you do not feel excited to work on your story, but you still need to work on it. So if you haven't spent time developing a strong story so that on those days when you don't feel as excited, you still know and can do what you need to do to create the story, you are going to be so much more likely to give up on it, or at least procrastinate. And if and when you hit a snag, it's going to be that much more difficult to push through it. You're going to be like, oh, this isn't fun anymore. I'm going to go on to my next idea that's more exciting. Novels just don't get finished that way. Now, if you edit as you go or you get stuck in perfectionism, you'll be less likely to finish your first draft because it won't feel perfect all the time. It just won't. And that will be insanely frustrating. And you'll get discouraged and you'll slow down, you'll procrastinate, or you'll stop completely. And then if you're focused on where and how you're going to get published, which is what a lot of us do, I'm not going to lie, we think way down the line. You won't ever get published if you don't have a first draft. So please do yourself a favor and focus on that first. What I find too is that this puts way too much pressure on you as you're writing. You start thinking like, oh, I want to publish this, so it needs to be perfect and everything has to be top of the line, high quality, the best thing that's ever been written. It's like, no. I almost feel like stress and pressure are what kills creativity the most. I know I said perfectionism kills it. I think perfectionism is rooted in that fear and that stress of wanting it to be really good and the pressure we're putting on ourselves. So when you're putting pressure on yourself, when you're putting stress on yourself, you're going to watch your creativity dwindle. And I don't want that for you. All of this can lead us to abandoning our first draft or just taking an epically long time to finish it, if we even do. And you know, who wants to spend 10 years on a novel that they never finish? Like, I want you to get this novel done so that you can write the next novel and write the novel after that, and you can actually be a productive working writer and feel fulfilled creatively. So what can you do about this if you find yourself jumping too far ahead? The most important thing, again, sound like a broken record here, is to develop your characters, develop your story before you start writing. and then get your story down on paper without editing it. No editing as we go. A lot of writers talk about how the first draft is not the best draft, right? Stephen King says the first draft of anything is Anne Lamott says write a first draft. The people who tend to say this are, not your average Joe Schmo off the street. Stephen King, he's written a couple books, right? So by the time writers like him say these things, their first drafts probably aren't all that Like, to compare Stephen King's first draft of a story to someone who is writing a story for the very first time, you're probably going to have a difference in quality there. So for that writer who's just starting out, I feel like this gives them an excuse to not learn how to write a story and what a story is and how a story works, and to think that everything is just easily fixed in revisions. It's not. Dealing with plot holes in revisions and having to rewrite tens of thousands of words and multiple chapters over and over again, it's exhausting. It's frustrating. Honestly, it's annoying. And it is, I think, one of the main reasons why people give up on their stories. So, as you write your first draft, it's not that quality doesn't matter. It's just that quality, high quality, finished product quality is not the main goal right now. The goal of your first draft is to finish your first draft. So don't make things purposefully but also, if you're hung up on sentences and word choice, you're getting into editing. Focus on completing sections of your story until you have a full story. Then you can work on changing things. But like I've said before, the more you know your characters, the more you have mapped out your plot, the easier this will be, because you're doing a huge chunk of the work up front versus leaving that work to do later in revisions. Don't let the pressure of publishing overwhelm you before you're ready. It kind of is another way to distract yourself. Like, you can research, you can world build, and you can Google publishing houses and agents and who you're going to send your finished draft to if one day, perhaps, maybe, finally you finish it. It's like, a lot of stress, a lot of pressure. Let's not do that. You gotta earn the right to query your novel by actually finishing one. All right, so 3 mistakes that will kill your chances of finishing your first draft: distracting yourself, getting and staying stuck, and jumping too far ahead. If this video was helpful, I think you might like these as well. And by liking and subscribing, you can make sure other writers find this video too. But otherwise, thanks for hanging out with me today. It was so good to see you, and I'll see you next time. Take care.